My mother-in-law considers me an enemy even after I got pregnant with her son. I met my now husband, Jake, at a 4th of July barbecue hosted by mutual friends. The evening was straight out of a rom-com, fireworks in the sky, country music playing from a crackly speaker, and Jake, tall, easygoing, and smiling at me like I was the only person in the world. I, on the other hand, was mid-hot dog choke and blushing so hard I could have matched the fireworks. But somehow, he still asked me out. Jake was one of those guys who felt like home from the moment you met him. He was warm, had this dorky laugh, and somehow made even the most mundane moments feel special. After a few months of dating, we became that couple, joint invites to events, silly inside jokes, and the kind of quiet understanding that people search their whole lives for. But there was one thing looming over us like a storm cloud. The mom introduction. Jake's mom, Linda, was a bit of a legend in his circle. Everyone said she was particular. She kept an immaculate house. Seriously, her floors were shinier than my future, and had a knack for finding fault in just about anyone who dared step into her perfectly curated world. When Jake told me we'd be having dinner at his parents' house, I felt like I was prepping for a job interview. I Googled how to make a good impression on a boyfriend's mom. I even brought flowers and a bottle of wine, thinking that would buy me some goodwill. Spoiler, it did not. When we arrived, Jake squeezed my hand and gave me a reassuring smile before we stepped inside. I barely had time to take in the pristine beige living room before Linda appeared from around the corner. "Oh," she said, taking one look at me. Not a warm "oh," like when you find $20 in your winter coat pocket. No, it was more like an "oh," when you see someone's dog did their business on your lawn. She barely gave me a once-over before turning to Jake with a tight smile. "Dinner's ready." Throughout the meal, Linda kept up this icy small talk, asking me where I worked, as if my perfectly normal office job was some sort of crime, what my plans were, because apparently being in my late 20s wasn't enough for her, and if my family traveled much. Translation, are you cultured enough to sit at her table? Jake, bless him, tried his best to smooth things over, but then came the comment. Halfway through dinner, Linda turned to Jake with her perfectly plucked eyebrows raised and said, "Jake, did you know Amanda's daughter just graduated summa cum laude? She's such a lovely girl. Always so poised. You two would have made such a beautiful couple." Jake choked on his water. I froze with my fork halfway to my mouth. For context, Amanda is Linda's best friend. Amanda's daughter, Sarah, is apparently the golden child of their social circle. Ivy League grad, fluent in 3 languages, a master pianist, and, of course, still single. You'd think she descended from royalty the way Linda talked about her. Jake managed to stammer out something like, "Mom, what the hell?" But Linda just sipped her wine like nothing had happened. When we left that night, Jake apologized 100 times in the car. "She just needs time," he kept saying. "She'll warm up to you, I promise." But I knew better. You don't warm up to someone you've already decided to freeze out. That was my introduction to Linda. And trust me, this was only the beginning. After that first dinner with Linda, I thought, okay, she doesn't like me. Fine. Maybe it's a first impressions thing. I gave myself a pep talk and decided to keep showing up, being polite, and hoping she'd eventually see me the way Jake did. Spoiler, she did not. The Amanda comments didn't stop after that dinner. They actually got worse. It was like every interaction with Linda was a new episode of The Amanda Show, guest starring me as the confused extra who wandered onto set. "Oh, Sarah just got accepted into a PhD program at Yale. Isn't that wonderful, Jake? Sarah just finished her 3rd charity fundraiser this month. She's so selfless. Did you hear Sarah speaks fluent French now? Such an elegant language. Some women just have a natural sophistication, you know. Subtle. Real subtle, Linda. Now, don't get me wrong, Sarah is impressive. And from what I could tell, she wasn't even in on Linda's little campaign. But it felt like no matter what I did, I couldn't measure up to this phantom, perfect wife candidate that Linda had designed in her head. One weekend, Jake convinced me to come to a family gathering at his parents' house. Big barbecue, extended family, the whole deal. I was nervous, but determined to just smile, be friendly, and keep my wine glass full enough to endure Linda's passive-aggressive comments. The moment we walked in, Linda greeted us with, "Oh, Jake. Sarah was here earlier. Such a shame you missed her." She looked radiant. Jake sighed audibly, but I stayed quiet. It wasn't worth it, but the real kicker came later that afternoon. I was helping Jake's aunt set out dessert when I overheard Linda talking to a family friend by the pool. "She's fine, I suppose," Linda said in a hushed voice. But I always imagined Jake with someone more refined. Someone like Sarah. They would have been such a power couple. I froze. My hands were still holding a tray of brownies, and I just stood there. Part of me wanted to march over and say something, but another part of me, one I'm not proud of, felt embarrassed. Like I wasn't enough. Later that evening, Jake noticed I was quieter than usual and asked what was wrong. I hesitated, but then I told him what I heard. His face turned red, and for the first time, I saw him genuinely angry with his mom. The next day, he called Linda and confronted her. I wasn't in the room, but I could hear raised voices from the other side of the door. When he came out, Jake was frustrated. She said she was just making conversation and that I'm overreacting. Classic Linda. After that phone call, things were strained. I started declining invitations to visit his parents' house, and Jake began going alone to family events. I didn't want to keep putting myself in situations where I felt belittled, and honestly, I think Jake understood. But here's the thing about Linda, she wasn't the type to let things go unnoticed. If I wasn't going to play along, she was going to find a way to drag me back into her little chess game. And oh, she found a way. When Jake proposed, it was perfect. We were on a weekend trip to the mountains, just the two of us, cozy in a little cabin with fairy lights strung across the porch. He got down on one knee under the stars, and I ugly cried through the entire proposal. It wasn't extravagant or overly planned. It was just us, but the glow of that perfect moment dimmed slightly when Jake told me we should probably call my mom before she hears it from someone else. I wasn't exactly excited about that phone call, but I agreed. Jake dialed her number, and I sat beside him on the couch, still clutching my new ring like it might disappear if I let go. Linda answered on the second ring, her voice sharp as ever. "Jake, what a surprise. Is everything okay?" Jake smiled at me before saying, "Actually, Mom, everything's great. I just proposed to my name, and she said yes." The silence on the other end lasted a little too long. "Oh, well, that is news," Linda finally said. "Congratulations, I suppose." She didn't ask how he proposed. She didn't ask to speak to me. She didn't ask anything. Just an awkward congratulations and a hasty, "Well, I'll let you two celebrate. Bye now." I looked at Jake, trying to gauge his reaction, but he just sighed. That went about as well as I expected. The next week, Jake convinced me to go to dinner at his parents' house to celebrate the engagement. I reluctantly agreed, telling myself it would just be one evening. I could handle it. When we arrived, Linda greeted us with her usual thin-lipped smile. She congratulated Jake with a hug, but barely acknowledged me. At dinner, she made a toast, one I will never forget. "To Jake," she said, raising her glass of Pinot Grigio. "May your marriage be everything you hope it will be. And may you always know how much you deserve the best in life." That was it. That was the toast. She didn't even say my name. Jake gave me a look across the table, a silent "I'm so sorry," but I just forced a smile and took a sip of my wine. Then, as if on cue, Linda brought up Sarah. "You know, Amanda mentioned that Sarah just got promoted at her firm. She's really doing so well for herself. Such an ambitious girl." At this point, I was starting to think Sarah was just Linda's version of a vision board, some impossible standard of womanhood no one could meet. But the peak moment of the evening came after dinner when Linda asked to see my ring. I held out my hand, trying to keep my smile steady. "It's lovely," she said, her lips pursed. "Simple. Understated. I suppose that suits you." I felt my stomach drop. Understated? It was exactly the ring I wanted, classic, with a small sapphire accent. But Linda said it like it was something you'd find in the clearance bin at a department store. On the drive home, Jake apologized again. He was frustrated, but he didn't know how to fix it. I told him it was fine, but honestly, I wasn't sure how many more dinners like that I could stomach. Wedding planning began soon after, and if you thought Linda would back off, oh, you'd be wrong. Because if there's one thing Linda loved more than passive-aggressive comments, it was control. Planning a wedding is supposed to be one of the happiest times of your life, right? Picking the dress, choosing flowers, taste-testing cake. Except when you have a mother-in-law like Linda, it feels more like planning a hostage negotiation. From the moment Jake and I announced our engagement, Linda treated the wedding like it was her event. She didn't even pretend to care about what I wanted. Her focus was entirely on appearances and, of course, making sure everything looked picture-perfect for her social circle. IT started small. Oh, you're having the wedding there? Well, I suppose rustic is charming. Those colors? Interesting choice. Amanda went with classic ivory and gold for Sarah's cousin's wedding. It was stunning. But then she escalated. Linda called my florist to suggest different centerpieces. She asked Jake if he thought my dress was flattering. After I showed her a picture, Jake hadn't even seen it yet, by the way. And the piece de resistance? She invited Sarah and Amanda to my bridal shower. Yes. Sarah did. I found out when I walked into my own bridal shower and saw her sitting there in a designer sundress, sipping mimosa and looking vaguely confused about why she was there. To her credit, Sarah was polite and friendly, but I could feel Linda's smug satisfaction radiating from across the room. I pulled Jake aside later and told him, "Your mom is out of control." To his credit, he tried. He really did. He had a sit-down conversation with her where he explained that this was our wedding and that she needed to back off. Linda's response? Tears. So many tears. After everything I've done for you, Jake, after raising you, you're choosing her over your own mother? Jake came home from that conversation looking defeated. She says she'll try to respect our boundaries, he told me. Spoiler, she did not. When the wedding day finally arrived, I was determined not to let Linda ruin it for me. I woke up early, surrounded by my bridesmaids, feeling genuinely happy and excited. But Linda wasn't done yet. She showed up to the wedding in, wait for it, a cream-colored dress, not ivory, not beige cream. Close enough to white that guests noticed. Jake noticed. Even my grandma noticed, and her eyesight isn't what it used to be. During the ceremony, I could see her sitting in the front row with her arms crossed, barely cracking a smile. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to our marriage, I swear I saw her twitch. But here's the thing. Despite all her efforts, despite the passive-aggressive comments, the meddling, and the theatrics, Jake and I still had a beautiful day. When I looked into his eyes as we said our vows, Linda didn't exist in that moment. The reception, though, she delivered one final blow. While Jake and I were making our rounds, thanking guests, I overheard her talking to Amanda. It was a nice wedding, she said. But can you imagine how stunning it would have been if Sarah had been the bride? Amanda hushed her, clearly uncomfortable, but I had already heard enough. For the first time since I'd met Linda, I decided I wasn't going to let it slide. I walked right up to her, smiled sweetly, and said, "Linda, I'm so glad you could be here today. Your support means so much to us." The look on her face was priceless. I think, in that moment, she realized I wasn't going anywhere. Jake and I left for our honeymoon the next day, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. But, of course, this wasn't the end. Linda was far from finished, because a year later, I got pregnant. And let me tell you, if you thought wedding planning brought out Linda's crazy side, oh, buckle up. When I found out I was pregnant, I cried. Jake cried. We hugged each other in our tiny kitchen, surrounded by takeout containers and mismatched coffee mugs. It was one of those beautiful, quiet moments where everything feels right. Then Jake said, "We should probably call my mom." My stomach immediately dropped. We decided to FaceTime Linda together, thinking it might soften the blow if she could see our faces and the excitement we were feeling. When she picked up, she was sitting in her pristine living room, sipping what I can only assume was her 5th glass of Chardonnay for the day. "Hi, Mom," Jake said, grinning ear to ear. "We have some big news." Linda's face was frozen in her usual "what now?" expression. "We're having a baby." I blurted out, unable to keep it in any longer. She blinked. Once, twice. Then her lips pursed into that thin line I had come to know so well. "Well, isn't that something?" she said. Jake tried to smooth it over. "We're really excited, Mom. You're going to be a grandma." But Linda wasn't smiling. Instead, she said, "I guess we'll see if you two are ready for this kind of responsibility. Babies are a lot of work." Jake ended the call not long after, and I stood there staring at my phone screen, half expecting her disapproval to start leaking out in pixel form. From that moment on, Linda became an expert in two things: unsolicited parenting advice and backhanded comments about my fitness to be a mother. She started sending me articles. You know the ones, the top 10 things expecting mothers should never do, and how to prepare for motherhood if you're completely unprepared. When we had our gender reveal, a simple backyard gathering with close friends and family, Linda showed up with a stack of neatly wrapped gifts. I thought, okay, maybe she's turning over a new leaf. But as I opened them, it became painfully clear they were not gifts, they were messages. Gift number 1, a book titled Raising Children the Right Way. Gift number 2, a onesie that said, "Grandma knows best." Gift number 3, a framed photo of baby Sarah, taken when she was 6 months old, with Linda's handwritten note, "Amanda raised such a perfect child. Maybe this will inspire you." I wish I were kidding. Jake confronted her after the party, but Linda doubled down. "I'm just trying to help, Jake. You can't expect me to not share my wisdom. Honestly, if you'd ended up with Sarah, we wouldn't even be having this conversation." Yes, there she was. Our uninvited guest of honor, Sarah. By my 3rd trimester, I was done. My back hurt, I couldn't see my feet, and I was running on a mix of hormones and sheer spite. Jake had started screening Linda's calls just to give me some peace, but then came the baby shower. My mom and sister threw me the most beautiful shower. Think pastel decorations, finger sandwiches, and all my favorite people gathered in one place. And yet, despite my better judgment, I let Linda come. She showed up late, made a big fuss about her entrance, and then spent the entire event sulking in the corner like a villain from a soap opera. But the moment I'll never forget came during the gift opening portion. Linda handed me a neatly wrapped box and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Hope this helps you at least try to be a good mother." Inside was a parenting manual, a literal 500-page book with chapters like When Mothers Are Too Soft and Avoiding Common First-Time Mother Mistakes. The room went silent. My sister's jaw dropped. My mom, my sweet, quiet mom, actually said, "Linda, that's enough." I closed the box, set it aside, and said, "Thank you, Linda. Your confidence in me is truly heartwarming." I don't think she expected me to clap back, because she turned bright red and sat down without another word. After the shower, Jake and I had a long talk. He promised that once the baby arrived, our family came first. Linda would have boundaries, whether she liked it or not. When our daughter finally arrived, perfect, tiny, and screaming her little lungs out, Jake and I felt like we had been handed the entire universe wrapped in a hospital blanket, but naturally. Linda's reaction to the birth was on brand. She walked into the hospital room, took one look at our daughter, and said, "She's cute. I think she looks more like Jake, thank goodness." But for once, I didn't care. I had my daughter. I had Jake. Linda could say whatever she wanted, because at that moment, nothing else mattered. But, oh, Reddit, this woman wasn't finished yet. The first few weeks after Emma was born were a blur of sleepless nights, diaper changes, and a level of exhaustion I didn't know was possible. Jake was back at work, and I was navigating motherhood mostly on my own. But even through the haze, there was one constant. Linda didn't see herself as a grandmother. She saw herself as a co-parent. She dropped by unannounced, brought parenting books with passive-aggressive titles, and made comments about my choices with the same tone someone might use to critique expired milk. She had an uncanny ability to find fault in everything. If Emma cried, it was because I wasn't swaddling her correctly. If I looked tired, it was because I wasn't following some routine she had read about in a parenting magazine from 1986. At one point, she started rearranging my kitchen during her visits. Apparently, my way of organizing bottles and sterilizers wasn't up to her standard. I'd find myself redoing her fixes after she left, muttering under my breath about boundaries and personal space, but the most exhausting part was her insistence on helping by trying to push me out of the equation. She would suggest, repeatedly, that I go upstairs to rest while she watched Emma. And while that might sound innocent on paper, the way she said it, the edge in her voice, the slight condescension, made it clear that she thought I wasn't doing enough as a mother. One afternoon, after a particularly tense visit where Linda hovered over me as I fed Emma, rearranged the nursery without asking, and commented on my pale complexion, Jake finally put his foot down. He told her visits would need to be scheduled from now on, and that her role was as a grandmother, not a third parent. For 2 weeks after that conversation, there was silence. No texts, no phone calls, no unannounced visits. And for a brief moment, I felt relief. I could bond with my daughter without feeling judged under Linda's ever-critical gaze, but deep down, I knew it was just the calm before the storm. The storm arrived in the form of Emma's baptism. From the moment we started planning the event, Linda inserted herself into every detail. She wanted input on the venue, the guest list, the outfits, everything. When we gently reminded her that it was our child and our event, she pulled back, but not entirely. On the day of the baptism, Linda arrived wearing an outfit that was just slightly too formal, as if she were the one being celebrated. She spent most of the day subtly correcting people on how they were holding Emma, rearranging decorations, and making herself the unofficial host of the event. At one point, during the group photos, she insisted on holding Emma for almost every shot. When Jake quietly asked her to let me have a moment with our daughter, she pursed her lips, stepped aside, and made sure her displeasure was clear to everyone within a 10-foot radius. After the baptism, as Jake and I were packing up, one of his aunts approached me. She mentioned how Linda had been talking throughout the day about how motherhood doesn't come naturally to everyone and how some women just struggle more than others. I had to take a walk outside to calm myself down before I said something I'd regret. The car ride home was silent, both Jake and I lost in our thoughts. I knew he was struggling, trying to balance his loyalty to me and his love for his mom. But as we pulled into our driveway, he turned to me and said, "This isn't going to continue. I promise." I wanted to believe him, but part of me knew Linda wasn't done yet, because when it came to Linda, boundaries were just challenges she hadn't yet figured out how to bypass. The weeks following Emma's baptism were eerily quiet. Linda had gone radio silent again, but this time, it felt different, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. I knew she wasn't done, but for a brief moment, I let myself enjoy the peace. Jake and I settled into our rhythm as new parents. The days were long, the nights were longer, but we were figuring it out together. Emma was growing, smiling, and becoming this tiny little person who made every sleepless night worth it. But Linda couldn't stay away forever. It started with a text. Just one. "We need to talk." Jake called her first, hoping to smooth things over before she dragged me into another emotional showdown. But whatever they talked about, it didn't help, because the next day, Linda showed up at our house, uninvited, with an expression I can only describe as determined disapproval. She didn't even say hello before launching into her speech. Linda told us she felt shut out, that she was only trying to help, and that as a mother herself, she had a right to be involved in her grandchild's life. She claimed I was too controlling and that Jake was too afraid to stand up to me, but then she said something that made me see red. "I think Sarah would have made a better mother to Jake's children. She's just more suited for this life." It was like time froze. Jake looked horrified, his face pale and tight with anger. But before he could say anything, I spoke. I told Linda, in a calm but firm voice, that this was my family. That her obsession with Sarah, someone who had absolutely nothing to do with us, was unfair, hurtful, and inappropriate. I reminded her that I had been nothing but patient, even when she treated me like I was a placeholder instead of Jake's wife and Emma's mother, and then I told her something I had been holding back for far too long. If you can't respect me as Jake's wife and Emma's mother, you will not have a place in our lives. Linda was stunned. For once, she didn't have a quick retort or a passive-aggressive jab ready. She stammered something about only wanting the best for Jake before she stormed out the front door. When the door closed behind her, I felt like I could finally breathe. Jake wrapped me in a hug and whispered, "I'm so proud of you." For weeks after, Linda stayed away. And this time, I didn't feel guilty about it. I didn't lose sleep wondering if I had been too harsh or if I'd somehow overstepped. Because the truth is, setting boundaries with someone like Linda isn't cruel, it's survival. Eventually, Linda did reach out again. The tone of her messages was different. They were shorter, less invasive, and, shockingly, contained no mention of Sarah. She started asking if she could visit, rather than announcing her arrival. Our relationship will probably never be warm and fuzzy, and honestly, I've made peace with that. Linda will always be Linda, sharp-tongued, opinionated, and more than a little stubborn. But in the end, she learned something important. I'm not going anywhere. I'm Jake's wife. I'm Emma's mother. And no amount of judgment or comparison to a phantom perfect bride will ever change that. And honestly, that's enough for me.
What would you do in a similar situation? Share your opinion in the comments.